A very warm welcome. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Now, a landmark, dramatic, high-level US-Russia prisoner swap is making headlines. Basketball star Brittney Griner is back on US soil after being imprisoned for months in Russia over drug charges. Griner landed in San Antonio in Texas to a tearful welcome by her family and friends. Griner is a two-time Olympic gold medalist whose incarceration in Russia brought unprecedented attention to the population of wrongful detainees. The deal, the second such exchange in 8 months with Russia, procured the release of the most prominent American detained abroad. The return of Brittney Griner comes in exchange for convicted Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout, who fueled some of the world's deadliest conflicts. The White House's authorization to release a Russian felon, once nicknamed the Merchant of Death, underscored the escalating pressure that his administration faced to get Griner back home. This swap, that too at a time of heightened tensions over Ukraine, achieves a top goal for US President Joe Biden.
This is a day we've worked toward for a long time. We never stopped pushing for her release. It took painstaking and intense negotiations, and I want to thank all the hardworking public servants across my administration who worked tirelessly to secure her release. I also want to thank the UAE for helping us facilitate Brittney's return, because that's where she landed. These past few months have been hell for Brittney and for Charlie and her entire family and all her teammates back home. People all across the country have learned about Brittney's story, advocated for her release, stood with her throughout this terrible ordeal. And I know that support meant a lot to her family. I'm glad to be able to say that Brittney's in good spirits.
Over the last 9 months, you all have been so privy to one of the darkest moments of my life. And so today I'm just standing here overwhelmed with emotions, but the most important emotion that I have right now is just sincere gratitude for President Biden and his entire administration. He just mentioned this work is not easy, and it has not been. There's been so many hands involved, and so I'd like to take a moment to just specifically mention a few. Vice President Harris, Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Josh Geltzer from the National Security Council, Roger Cartson and Fletcher Schoen from the Hostage Envoy's Office. A special thank you to Governor Richardson and Mickey, the Mercury Players, the WNBPA for your advocacy. And also, you guys may not know this, but my family has been tremendously supported by the Wasserman Agency. BG's agent, Lindsay Colas, has just been amazing for me and my family throughout this process.
This was just really emotional. I'm not a hugely emotional person, but I got very choked up and kind of knew for a couple of days that something might be happening, but you never know again until it happens in that moment, and things, fall through at the last minute. So when it happened this morning, I just emotional, Doug, is all I can say.
Let's tell you more about this swap now. The American basketball star Brittney Griner has been released after nearly 10 months in Russian custody. This as part of a long-rumored prisoner exchange brokered by officials in Washington and Moscow. Griner is arguably the greatest female basketball player of all time and is the marquee player for the Women's National Basketball Association, or the WNBA, in the United States, a two-time Olympic gold medalist as well. The 32-year-old disappeared on 17 February this year, just days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place, as she was passing through Moscow's international airport. She was later charged with carrying cannabis oil in her luggage and sentenced to 9 years in prison. She's one of the most prominent LGBTQ athletes in the world. But who was Griner exchanged for? And that is Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout, who was swapped for the WNBA star. He is widely known outside the country as the Merchant of Death, who fueled some of the world's worst conflicts. At home in Russia, however, he's seen as a swashbuckling businessman who was unjustly imprisoned after being convicted in 2011 on terrorism charges in what his supporters called an overly aggressive US sting operation. The former Soviet Air Force officer gained fame supposedly by supplying weapons for civil wars in South America, the Middle East, and even Africa. His clans were said to include Liberia's Charles Taylor, longtime Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, and both sides in Angola's civil war. Russia has been pressing for Bout's release for years now.
Naturally, I followed all of the publications, all of the statements of our top officials, including Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, and everybody in general. And of course, I have been running over in my head, imagining when it will happen. You kind of hope that it will happen, and today Maria Butina called me and said, "Well, hold on." I said, "Okay, everything is clear. Probably they have swapped him." I had strong chills. My heart was beating.
And guess which is the country which is taking credit for this prisoner swap, and that is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's controversial Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the President of the UAE have claimed they led the mediation efforts that led to the release of the basketball star Brittney Griner. Griner had reached Abu Dhabi from Moscow after her release by Russian authorities just before leaving for the United States. The White House, however, has ruled out any mediation, saying the prisoner swap was a direct deal between the United States and Russia.
There was no mediation involved. We are grateful for the UAE, as the President mentioned, as I am mentioning now, for facilitating the use of their territory for the exchange to take place. We are also grateful to other countries, including Saudi Arabia, that released the issue of our wrongfully detained Americans with Russian government, that raised that issue. But again, I don't have anything more to say. But when it comes to her release, it was between the U.S. government and Russia.
And yet the victory of Griner's release for the US remains only partially at best. Following the release of Brittney Griner from Russian captivity, US President Joe Biden faces fresh questions about another imprisoned American, former US Marine Paul Whelan. The 52-year-old Whelan was given a 16-year jail sentence in the year 2020 after being arrested in Moscow on suspicion of spying in 2018. His family and the U.S. government have termed these charges against the Michigan corporate security executive as baseless. Paul Whelan's family in the U.S., while expressing happiness that Griner was home, were disappointed that relief for Paul remained distant.
The important part today is human rights violations in the prison. The fact that the Moscow prosecutor absolutely refuses to talk to me about human rights violations that are occurring in the prison. I'm the victim of an assault by a prison agent, and that's something that you need to cover.
He'd mentioned things like, if he was freed, where would he live when he came back to the States? And so I think he had hopes that the offer that Secretary Blinken mentioned back in August was something that might actually come to fruition. Now, when it would come to fruition, he wasn't sure, but it sounded like he was hopeful that there was a possibility. And he was able to speak to our parents from early December up until today. He's spoken to them today. And obviously today is a much different phone call than he has had in the past. He's very disappointed.
This was not a choice of which American to bring home. The choice was one or none. I wholeheartedly wish that we could have brought Paul home today on the same plane as Brittney, just as at the time, I wish we could have brought Brittney and Paul home when we secured the release of Trevor Reed back in April. But we will stay at it. We continue to work with the Whelan family, who've been extraordinarily gracious, and we hold them in our thoughts and prayers always, but especially today. And we will never relent until Paul, and for that matter, every other U.S. national held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad is free and coming home and joining their families where they belong.